The Sony ZV-E10 does not look great, but it actually has a lot of potential if you set it up with the right settings. And it's important to make sure you have the right settings dialed in for your shooting scenario. So in this video, I'm gonna show you how to get the most out of your Sony ZV-E10 with a quick setup guide and how to dial in your perfect settings for both photos and cinematic video. If you want the best price on the ZV-E10, make sure to check out the links in the description down below. All right guys, let's get right into it. Right up here at the top, you'll see an on and off button, and then below that is a button to go between photo, video, and slow motion mode. The button with the red circle is your video record mode, and then right up here at the top, you'll see another button. This is your shutter button for your photos. Next to it, you'll see a zoom rocker for digital zoom and clear image zoom. And next to that is a defocus button.
Basically what it does is it opens up the aperture all the way open so you get this nice blurry background, and it'll adjust all the other settings so that you can get a properly exposed image.
Next up, let's talk about the quick function menu. So on the back of your camera, you'll see a button with FN. Once you click into that, you'll have a quick menu pop up at the bottom of your camera. This is going to allow you to change all of your major settings on your camera. And you can also customize this quick menu to have the exact settings that you want. For this, you want to go into Menu, go to the second tab on the second last page, go to Function Menu Set, click into that, and with this page, you can easily take out whatever settings you don't want or add settings that you want. Next up, let me show you the different shooting modes on the camera so you can set this camera up for your exact shooting scenario. For this, you want to go back into your function menu, go into the bottom right icon, click into that, and you'll see a bunch of different shooting modes, but there's only two that you really need to care about. One is automatic. This is where the camera does all the work for you and makes all the major decisions for you, but I recommend shooting in manual mode because in this mode, you can choose your shutter, aperture, and ISO to make sure you get the perfect image. Also, by shooting in manual mode, you also have greater control over specific settings in the camera that help you get the best colors from it. And speaking of shutter, aperture, and ISO, let me quickly show you how to change those settings on this camera. For shutter, you simply want to rotate this scroll wheel on the back, and that's going to change your shutter speed right here at the bottom. For aperture, you want to turn this knob right here, this black unmarked knob. This will change your aperture in the back, and your aperture will depend on what kind of lens you have on this camera. And for ISO, you want to click right, and here you can change your ISO easily. So that's how you change the three major settings on this camera. Also, if you really want to customize your camera, you can also go into the menus and choose different custom buttons. This is how you do it. You want to go back into your menu, and on the exact same page we were on before, there's also custom keys, one's for photos, one for video. And right in here, you can actually customize every single button on the back of this camera so it does exactly what you want. And there's two settings that I have to show you guys because most people usually mess these up, including myself. For this, you want to go back into your function menu and you want to click over to AWB. This is your white balance, and you want to make sure it's set to the exact shooting scenario you're in. It will give you options like daylight, shade, cloudy, incandescent, different lighting scenarios, and this way the camera uses the right color matrix to make sure that it's accurate to the lighting you're in. Otherwise, you might get a yellow or blue cast on all your images. And if you're not sure if you're using the right shutter speed, ISO, or aperture, the easiest thing to do is at the bottom of your camera screen, you'll see MM. This is your light meter, and next to it, you'll usually see a number that's like -2 +1. This basically tells you how too bright or too dark you are. If there's a negative number, it's too dark. If there's a positive number, it's too bright. For the ZV-E10, you either want to make sure it's right at 0 or it's at +1. Anything above that, your image will be too bright. Everything below 0, your image will be too dark. This is going to help you make sure you always have properly exposed images. Now, if you want to get great photos and videos, you want to make sure your autofocus is set up properly. Otherwise, it's going to be a struggle to use this camera. Now, this is done with two different settings in your function menu. Once you hit your function menu, you want to go over to focus mode or focus area. Now, once you go into focus area, there's three different options: wide, zone, and flexible spot. For most people, I recommend using wide because it lets the autofocus look at your entire image area and figure out what needs to be in focus. Or there is zone. This basically chooses a specific zone in your image area. You can choose, once you click into it, you can choose the middle, left, right, top. And this is for specific shooting scenarios where you know your subject's either going to be in the top left, top right, and this way the autofocus is just focusing on that area. And lastly, you have flexible spot. This is to make sure that whatever you're focusing on is inside of this little square. You can move it anywhere in the image area, but this way it's just focusing on that small box. For most people, I do recommend using wide. Next up is focus mode, and this is really specific to whether you're shooting photos or videos. Once you go into focus mode, you'll see single shot AF, automatic AF, and then continuous AF. If you're in photo mode and you know you're looking at something that's just sitting in one place, single shot AF basically catches focus on something, takes a shot, and it does not move focus until you hit the shutter button again. But for most people, I actually recommend shooting in automatic AF in photo mode. This will make sure that even if your subject is moving, if the camera's moving, it will basically track focus as the camera or subject moves. But if you're in video mode, the only option you really have is continuous AF. This is for moving subjects. Even if they're sitting still, this is really the option to use. And below that, you have DMF and manual focus, which I don't recommend using. If you're gonna spend so much money on a camera like this, I recommend using the automatic modes. All right, let's get into the fun stuff. How do you get the best colors from your ZV-E10? Well, there's two different ways to do this, and they're different for both photos and videos. If you want great colors in photo mode, what you wanna do is you wanna go into function menu, go down to right here, creative style, and this will give you a bunch of options like portrait, vivid. Standard does not look very good, but I recommend portrait because it seems to have the best colors. It brightens up your image a little bit so it doesn't feel as dark. For 99% of people, I either recommend using portrait or landscape. Everything else is just okay. Sunset has like a weird yellow cast to it. I don't really recommend it. There's also black and white in sepia, which has like an old-timey look to it. But again, for most people, portraits and landscape is going to give you the best colors, and also it's going to make your photos and videos look the best. But if you're shooting photos and you're someone that likes to edit photos, I'm gonna show you a setting later in this video that lets you get the most data from your photos so that you have the most room when it comes to editing. Now, for videos, it's a little bit more complicated because some people just want great videos out of the camera, and some people like to have as much room to play around with the colors later on. So for you, you can either use a creative style, or you can turn off creative style, go to standard, go back into the function menu, go into picture profile, and this is going to give you 10 different options. It doesn't really matter which one you pick, just pick your favorite number. Go into that picture profile, and there's two picture profiles that I recommend using. One is Cine 4. This is going to give you very filmic colors, so you want to go into Gamma, pick Cine 4, go down to color mode, and make sure you pick Cinema if you're using Cine 4. Or if you want maximum flexibility with your colors and you want to make your videos into something cinematic, go into Gamma, go down to S-Log 3. You want to make sure you use S-Log 3, and then go to color, and you want to go down to sgamut3.cine. This is going to give you the best colors, and this way you're going to get the most room to play around with your colors later on. One setting that I highly recommend turning off is soft skin effect. This is turned on by default, but it simply looks bad on everybody. So for this, you want to go into menu, make sure you're in tab 1, and it's the third last page, as you can see on the screen. Go into soft skin, and you want to make sure this is off. By default, it's set to mid or high, but you want to make sure it's off, and this way you'll get the best looking skin. So in order to get the best quality photos and videos, it's more than just what color mode you're shooting in. You also want to make sure you pick the right file type, and this is different for both photos and video. So assuming you're in photo mode, you want to go into menu, and on the very first page, you'll see file format. You want to click into this, and you have a few options: RAW, RAW plus JPEG, and JPEG. If you're someone that's just a casual user, you want to get great photos in camera, just simply shoot JPEGs, and those are the photos that you will post or do whatever you want with. But if you're a power user like me, I recommend shooting neither RAW or RAW plus JPEG. RAW plus JPEG is useful because when you're looking at your photos on your computer, you have a JPEG right next to every single RAW photo, so you know exactly what that photo is before you open up in whatever program you use. So let's assume we're going with RAW plus JPEG, and you want to go down to JPEG quality, and you also want to make sure you pick extra fine for JPEGs. This way you're going to get the best quality JPEGs. And there's also the aspect ratio that you shoot in. Now this is really important. If you're someone that already knows they're going to be posting this on Instagram, you can actually pick 4:3, which is square, 3:2, which is the entire sensor, 16:9, which is the widescreen TV ratio that you see here, or 1:1, which is a 1:1 square. This way you can set your camera up for the exact format you're going to be posting in. And depending on what you're shooting, you also want to make sure you pick the right frame rate. Now the ZV-E10 does shoot at 10 frames per second, but you don't have to use the maximum 10 frames per second, otherwise you're just getting a bunch of photos that you don't really need. So to change the setting from your main screen, hit the left button on your scroll wheel and you'll have a bunch of settings come up. The main one to look out for is single shooting, where it just takes one photo and then stops. Then there's continuous shooting, where it keeps taking photos as long as the shutter button is pressed down. And for this you can pick different modes, where at high you'll get 10 frames per second, at mid you'll get about 5 or 6, and at low you're getting about 2 or 3 frames per second. So depending on how many photos you want, how fast your subject is moving, you can pick different frame rates. If you're a casual user that really doesn't know how to use this camera yet, I recommend simply shooting in high mode. This way you get every photo you need, and as you get better with this camera, you can pick what frame rate to shoot at. Next up, let's talk about how to set up your video properly. For this, you want to go into menu and you want to scroll over to the second tab, and down here you'll see a bunch of options. One thing to make sure is you want to make sure your shoot mode is set to manual exposure, and then you want to go into file format. Now for this, you have two options. One is XAVC-S 4K and one is XAVC-S HD. 4K gives you 4K and HD simply gives you full HD resolution. Depending on what you're shooting and what you want, you'll get different frame rates and different options in each. Let's first take a look at 4K. So once you go into 4K mode, right below that you'll see record settings, and here you'll see different frame rates. You can shoot at 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. So depending on how good you want the quality to be, you can pick 30p at 100 megabits per second or 60 megabits per second. For most people, I simply recommend shooting at the highest 100 megabits per second because you're really not going to save that much space and you want to make sure you get the most out of this camera. So for this reason, I recommend shooting in either 30p 100 megabits per second or 24p 100 megabits per second. And for this example, we'll go with 24p. Next up, let's take a look at HD. So inside of HD, you'll see a bunch of different options as well. Now you have a lot more frame rates. You have 30p, you have 24p, but you also have 120 frames per second for 5 times slow motion and 60 frames per second for 2 times slow motion. This is where it records that frame rate in camera. Now this has two options. One, you can simply record at 60 frames per second to get really smooth motion blur or really smooth movement in camera. This is really good to have smooth motion for like sports or any kind of thing where you want your audience to be really immersed in the content. You can also use it for slow motion by slowing it down later. However, this camera does have a slow motion mode that I will show you in just a second. But go ahead and pick whatever frame rate you want depending on what you're shooting. If you're shooting something cinematic, I recommend sticking with 24p because that's the frame rate movies are shot in. Next up, let's talk about slow motion because that's really important on this camera. For this, we want to go back to the top of our camera, hit this button, go into slow motion mode, and once we go back into menus, you want to go down to slow S&Q setting. And for this, you have two options, record setting and frame rate. So for this, you want to set your record setting to as low as possible. We'll go with 24p. And then your frame rate to either 120 frames per second or 120p. And what this does is it slows down the footage in camera. This way you don't have to take it into an editing software and slow it down later on. This is really good for someone that doesn't want to edit their footage and just wants slow motion in camera to show people. So for this, you want to pick the highest frame rate, which is 120 or 60 frames per second, pick that. And now whatever you shoot will already be slowed down in camera. But there's one really interesting trick with this camera is that if you go to a lower frame rate than your recording frame rate, like let's say 8 frames per second or 4 frames per second, which you'll actually notice at the bottom, it now says 6 times quick motion. What this allows you to do is it simply allows you to almost shoot a time lapse or a hyperlapse in video where it shoots at a slower frame rate than your record frame rate. So when you play back the video, everything will look sped up. This is really good if you want to take the camera, move through a space for a hyperlapse or a time lapse. This is a really convenient way to do it. And there's also a way to shoot time lapses or interval shooting in photo mode. So set your camera to photo mode, go back into menu, and here you'll see interval shooting mode on the first tab on the third page. Once you click into that, you'll see a couple of options, but you want to make sure interval shooting mode is on. Then shooting start time, 1 second. Shooting interval, where basically it picks how much of a pause it takes between taking photos. So we'll set it to like, let's say 5-6 seconds. And then you want to set number of shots, and you want to actually pick the highest number of shots you can possibly get. So we'll just pick 999 on everything. And this way, what it'll basically do is it'll take a photo every 6 seconds up to 999 photos. And this way you can get a really beautiful time lapse just using photos. The advantage for using photos for time lapses is that this camera does shoot higher quality photos than videos. So this way you can get a much higher quality time lapse by using raw photos. Now, audio is a huge part of using this camera. So to make sure you get the perfect audio, go back into your quick function menu, go all the way to the left, click into that, and you'll see a record level. So for this, you basically want to talk, and you'll see levels at the bottom. And you want to try to be as loud as possible, like check, check, check. And you want to make sure whatever you have your record level set to, that it's not too high, so that this recording meter doesn't go into the red. And another setting that's really important is you want to go back into menu, go to the second tab on the third page, and you'll see wind noise reduction. You want to make sure you have this on at all times. It's not going to affect you if there's no wind noise, but just in case you're in a place where there's a lot of background noise or wind noise, it will cancel that out automatically. Now, using this camera isn't just about getting the right settings in it. Well, it's a big part of it. But another thing that's really important is to make sure you have the right accessories for this camera. So in order to get the fastest recording frame rates or the fastest photo frame rates, you want to make sure you have at least a V30 card or a V90 card. Actually, a V90 might be overkill, but you want to make sure you have at least a V30 card. This way, your camera won't need as much of a break when shooting photos, and you also want to pick up a cage for this camera if you're maybe a content creator or a professional vlogger. This way you'll have kind of like an armor on this camera that, one, it protects the camera, but it also lets you mount accessories to this camera and more easily lets you put it on a tripod or a gimbal. The two cages that I really like, I'll leave links in the description down below. I really like the cages from SmallRig and Tilta. And another really important thing are your batteries. Because this camera has such a small battery, I recommend having plenty of spares. Now, if you go on Amazon, there's third-party battery manufacturers that will give you batteries for like dirt cheap. They're like 20 bucks a battery. I actually do recommend using them. They may not last as long as the official Sony batteries, but considering how expensive the Sony batteries are, the third-party batteries are an amazing deal, and you can get like 4 for like 50 bucks. Or you can also use a USB power supply dummy battery, just like I am on this M50. This basically puts a battery at the bottom of your camera, and it lets you run a power cord to your power outlet, so that way you have a just power to your camera at all times. This is really useful if you're someone like me that records videos for YouTube or any other platform where you're sitting down a lot and you don't want to have to worry about running out of battery. If you're a content creator that's making content with your ZV-E10, I also recommend having a small light. You can find a cheap RGB light on Amazon. This is a random light that I found for 40 bucks, but the one that I recommend most people get is the Aperture MC light. It's really small, but very, very powerful. It's about $120, but it's probably the best pocket light you can get. With all of these settings dialed in, you will without a doubt get amazing photos and videos for whatever you're shooting. And if you want the best price on the ZV-E10 or the accessories I talked about today, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.